Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 20 of the JFK Assassination 60 years later. This is the second to the last in this series. Next week will be the final segment. Today we're going to talk about the why of the assassination, and next week we're going to put it all together, all the pieces that we've analyzed in this series. We're going to put it together. And just as a teaser, I'm going to be talking about, for example, the ingenuity of this plot, the sheer ingenuity. Now, I mean that in a negative sense, a dark side sense. I mean, we're talking about brilliant people here in the CIA, which clearly orchestrated this assassination. And we're talking about Ivy League graduates, brilliant people who have devoted their lives to the dark art of assassination and cover-up. So we would expect nothing less than a brilliant plot. And one of the aspects of this, which I'll be talking about, for example, is it involved framing a person who purportedly is firing from the rear. But notice that we've talked about the fact that there have been shots fired from the front, and that the mission of the autopsy pathologist was to hide the fact that there's shots fired from the front and make it look like all the shots have come from the rear. Now ask yourself, if you're going to frame a person firing from the rear, why in the world would you have shots fired from the front and then go through a fraudulent autopsy to hide the fact that shots have been fired from the front? Wouldn't it be much easier if you're going to frame a person firing from the rear to simply have shots being fired only from the rear? We're going to be talking about that next week because that goes to the very ingenuity, in a dark side sense, of this plot. Now, why did they assassinate President Kennedy? You have critics saying, oh, Jacob, how can you suggest that they would do something this evil? I mean, there's no possibility that the Pentagon and the CIA would engage in the evil action of assassinating a U.S. president. Well, you've got to keep in mind that from their perspective, they're not committing evil at all. From their perspective, they are the patriots. They're protecting America. They're protecting national security. From the standpoint of a person in the national security establishment, the CIA, the Pentagon, the NSA, their job is to protect national security, which entails identifying threats to national security, especially the serious threats, the grave threats to national security, and then resolve those threats, get rid of them, so that America can exist and survive and continue on. If you look, for example, at their assassination of Congo leader Patrice Lumumba, they don't consider themselves evil for orchestrating that assassination because they considered Lumumba to be a grave threat to national security because they said he was leaning communist. Okay? Remember, this is the height of the Cold War, all the anti-Russia sentiment, the international communist conspiracy that was supposedly based in Moscow, the same Moscow we hear from today, the Red Chinese, the Russians are coming, and this was the mindset. So, for example, when they target Guatemala with a regime change operation in 1954, you've got a democratically elected president there. And because he was being friendly to the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, the communist world, he was deemed to be a grave threat to national security. So they orchestrated a coup there that clearly had Arbans within their assassination sites. Now, they've never released their list of people that they were targeting with assassination as part of this coup, but clearly Arbans has to be at the top of the list because he's the guy that they were going after. And so they don't consider themselves evil for targeting Arbans with assassination because in their minds, they're doing something patriotic. They're protecting America from what they have deemed to be a grave threat to national security. Same thing with 1953, 10 years before the Kennedy assassination. 53, 10 years before the Kennedy assassination, with Mossadegh in Iran. He was deemed to be leaning communist, and so they had to oust him from power. So the CIA engineers a coup there and installs a brutal pro-U.S. dictator, the Shah of Iran. They train his secret domestic police force. Enormous tyranny, ultimately to where the Iranian people finally revolted against it. And if we go in 1973, or 1970 to 73, the U.S. officials were convinced that the democratically elected president of Chile was a grave threat to national security. But what was interesting here is that they did not orchestrate his assassination, but instead convinced the national security establishment, their counterparts, because Chile was a national security state too, that they had a moral duty to oust their democratically elected president from office violently. I mean, when the war came, the violent war between these two branches of government, the executive branch represented by the president, the national security branch represented by the armed forces, they tried to assassinate Allende. First of all, I mean, they were firing missiles at him. They weren't, and they had him surrounded with infantry and armor, which were firing him, trying to kill him. And it was because they became convinced that they needed to save the country. In the minds of Pinochet and all of his forces, they were acting patriotically. They were the right ones. They were not that they were engaged in evil. And of course, at the end of it, Allende was left dead. 3 years before that, General Rene Schneider was left dead as a result of a assassination, a kidnapping plot against Schneider by the CIA that resulted in his violent death on the streets of Santiago. So you got to look at it from their mindset. They're the patriots here. They're not engaged in evil. Now, if we turn to Kennedy, Kennedy comes into office as pretty much a standard Cold Warrior. And what I mean by that is that he had bought into all this. Most everybody did. That America's faced with this communist threat. There's Cuba 90 miles away. The Reds are coming. The Russians are coming, and so forth. But there was one interesting difference, is that Kennedy sympathized with independence movements in where the colonial powers were controlling these third world countries. These independence movements were driven by the horrific way that people in these countries were being treated by the imperial powers, Great Britain, France, Belgium, and so forth. And so Kennedy said, right on that they're seeking their independence. They should be seeking their independence. Well, that was not the position of the national security establishment. The Pentagon and the CIA, they were firmly convinced that these independence movements were communist-driven, and that if permitted to succeed, that would mean that the Reds would be getting closer to America. So that was why they orchestrated the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Congo, before Kennedy came into office. They hurried it up, knowing that Kennedy was going to get sworn in, and they wanted to get that assassination done beforehand because they knew that if he learned about it, he would block it. And they succeeded in doing that. So Kennedy comes into office, he's sworn in, and almost immediately the CIA presents him with a plan to invade Cuba. Not directly, not with U.S. forces, but with Cuban exiles. And the plan is that they're going to make it look like Cuban exiles have invaded this island, the people of Cuba. The CIA told Kennedy are going to rise up, they're going to march to Havana, and they're going to oust Castro and install another pro-U.S. regime. And so the entire plot from the very beginning was based on lies, which, not surprising. I mean, we all know the CIA is based on lies. That's what they do well. And so the idea was they were going to tell the world, we had nothing to do with this. We had nothing to do with this. This is just Cuban exiles. And Kennedy was going to be the liar in chief. That was central to the plan that he approved of, that he was going to get up there and say, oh, we have nothing to do with this. Well, Kennedy asked the CIA, are you sure that we're not going to need U.S. intervention here, like air support or invasion or whatever? Because I'm not going to approve that. You see, he wanted to be able to lie to people that U.S. has nothing to do with this, and he didn't want intervention on the part of the U.S. forces, and so the CIA lied to him. Here's the plan's based on the lie, but here's a sub-lie where the CIA is lying to the president. They say, no, we won't need any U.S. support on this thing. And the reason they were lying is because they figured that this guy's just a neophyte. They've been in existence since 1947, and under Truman and then Eisenhower, they pretty much had free reign. They could do whatever they wanted, and they were accustomed to that this is where real power exists in Washington. And so they figured they're going to play this president. This guy's a neophyte, brand new president. They're going to. So what the idea was that as soon as the invaders, the Cuban exiles, started to go down in defeat, massacred on the beach there at the Bay of Pigs and taken captive, they would go to Kennedy and say, oh, well, we need that support after all. And Kennedy would have no choice because there's no way he could let this force go down to defeat by the communists. I mean, how would he justify it in the eyes of the world? So they were playing him. They were maneuvering. They were manipulating him. And so from their standpoint, it was a great plan. So sure enough, the plan starts going down to defeat, and Kennedy, they come to Kennedy and say, well, it turned out we were wrong. We need that support after all. And so they're fully expecting him to say, you're absolutely right. I'm going to send in U.S. forces. And Kennedy stands by his guns and says, no. I told you no U.S. support. There's going to be no U.S. support. And they were stunned because their plan hadn't worked. Their little plan of the neophyte president hadn't worked. So Kennedy lets the whole thing go down to defeat. And that was the beginning of the war between Kennedy and the CIA. They never forgave him for this. They considered him a coward, a betrayer. I mean, there was men killed on the beach there, and the others were taken captive by Castro's forces. It was just a total fiasco, defeat, a deadly defeat. Cuban exiles were furious at Kennedy. So from the very beginning here, they look at Kennedy as a traitor. Okay. Now, if you go to the day of the assassination in Dallas, there was a flyer there that was circulating, and also there was an advertisement in the Dallas Morning News, and you can see both of those online. Just Google flyer JFK Dallas and advertisement Dallas Morning News JFK, and you'll see where they call Kennedy a liar, a traitor, a pro-communist, and that was the mindset here after the Bay of Pigs, that he was a traitor, a coward, and so forth. So, well, but they still consider Cuba a grave threat to national security, and so does Kennedy. He's still in this mindset. Okay, well, how can we get rid of Castro without invading? But the military is insistent on an invasion, and they press Kennedy, and they continue to press him. We have to invade Cuba, and they present him this unbelievable plan called Operation Northwoods. I mean, I Google that one or look it up on Wikipedia. It is shocking. It was passed unanimously by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They were serious about it. It was a false flag operation where they were going to use terrorists and sabotage, and real people were going to die, plane hijackings, all committed by CIA agents or Pentagon agents posing as Cuban agents. And then Kennedy's job was going to be, we've been attacked by Cuba, now we have to order an invasion. And of course, the idea was that nobody would find out that these were really U.S. agents. So Kennedy, to his everlasting credit, rejects that plan. But they keep pressing him. You need to invade, you need to invade. And, well, Castro's not unaware of this. I mean, one thing about Castro, he was not a dumb man, and he knew there was all this pressure to invade Cuba. So that's part of the reason why he accepts this invitation of the Soviet Union to put nuclear weapons there in Cuba. Because Castro says, well, I can't beat the U.S. Army, and there's no way he could have defeated the U.S. Army in an invasion. So he figures, well, the nuclear missiles will be, first of all, a deterrent, that the U.S. won't invade because we'll fire these missiles back at you. And now the press always calls it, and historians always calls it, offensive missiles. Well, no, they weren't offensive. They were defensive. It was to defend Cuba because the Pentagon and the CIA wanted to invade. And now the missiles could reach New York and Washington, the eastern seaboard, Miami. But the whole idea was we're not going to start a war with you. We're just going to defend. Well, this was a big crisis because the Pentagon and the CIA wanted to invade Cuba, and now they've got these nuclear missiles. So now you got a big crisis here, and so Kennedy is trying to work his way around the crisis, negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev, trying to figure out a way out of this thing. But the military, their position is clear. You've got now your excuse to go in there and start bombing and invading. And what the CIA didn't know was that the nuclear missiles were fully armed. They didn't know that. And for a while, the commanders on the ground had battlefield authority to use them. Ultimately, Khrushchev took it away in the middle of the crisis and said, no, you got to check with me first. But there's no telling what these commanders would have done if there had been a full-scale invasion. So Kennedy realizes this. And in the midst of this, Bobby Kennedy is negotiating with Anatoly Dobrynin, who was a personal friend of his, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. They're trying to reach a way out of this where both sides can save face. They both realize how close they were to all-out nuclear war, and they're both trying to get out of this fix. And so Kennedy tells Dobrynin, you need to tell Khrushchev that we're very close to a military takeover here. Just like in Chile in 73, the military was prepared to take over. That was the fear. And Kennedy's expressing this concern to Dobrynin, and Dobrynin and Khrushchev knew exactly what that meant. That if the military were to oust Kennedy, as Bobby Kennedy was suggesting they might, that there'd be an all-out nuclear war, no question. So Khrushchev realizes that Kennedy's not bluffing, and he strikes a deal with Kennedy, where Kennedy vows that the U.S. will not invade Cuba. And then Khrushchev says, well, hey, how about taking your nuclear missiles out of Turkey? I mean, you don't like nuclear missiles in Cuba. How about getting them out of Turkey? They're right here on our border, And Kennedy says, you got it. Yours. Just give me 6 months, so let's just do it secretly, so it won't affect him politically. And so they struck this deal. Well, everybody was relieved, but not the military and the CIA. They were furious. And those sentiments and that flyer and that advertisement rise to the surface right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the generals called it the greatest defeat in U.S. history. And they compared Kennedy's actions during the crisis, like the blockade, to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement at Munich. I mean, they were furious. They considered him a coward. And notice what Kennedy's done. He's guaranteed that Cuba now will remain permanently in communist hands, which they were convinced America couldn't survive with a communist outpost 90 miles away. So now you've got a real problem here between these two branches of government, the executive branch and the national security branch, because Kennedy has said that outpost is going to stay, because the only way you could oust the outpost is through an invasion, and the national security branch is saying America won't survive that. And so that, at that point after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I believe is the most likely time when they determined at that point, we need to act to protect our nation by ousting this man from office, because it was clear that Kennedy was going to win the 64 race against Barry Goldwater, and then there's another 4 years, and then probably followed by his brother Bobby with another 8 years. And so they couldn't afford to wait. Just like in Allende's case, the national security establishment there didn't want to wait till the next election, because they figured Chile would go the communist route, the Cuba route, before the next election. Well, at this point, Kennedy achieves one of the most remarkable breakthroughs that has ever been, at least in the history of this country. I really don't know anything really like it, because what happens with this guy is he achieves a breakthrough, like those of us that become libertarians. I mean, a lot of us, it was like a breakthrough to the truth. That's what happened with me when I discovered libertarianism. I was a liberal Democrat, and I believed that the government should be helping the poor and so forth. And then I discovered libertarianism, and it's just this inch-thick wall of indoctrination that encased my mind was just shattered. And I realized that I'd been lied to and so forth. And, well, this is what happened with Kennedy. He achieves this breakthrough that enables him to see the Cold War for the racket that it was. And it was a racket. It was a racket. There was never any danger of the Russians and the Soviets coming and get us and conquering our nation and occupying the country. The whole notion was ridiculous. But it was a great way to provide a real lucrative machine here for the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. And keep in mind that that's why America was converted to a national security state after World War II in the first place, to deal with the so-called communist threat. Our original founding governmental system was a limited government republic. And so you get this dark side apparatus that's attached onto our regular constitutional order that now has the power of assassinations, coups, torture, indefinite detention, and all the other dark side things that we've seen. Well, Kennedy realizes that this is not only a destructive racket, but it's a deadly racket. He realized how close we came to nuclear war, because what the historians and the mainstream press here never acknowledge is that it's the Pentagon and the CIA who were responsible for the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were the ones that brought us so close to nuclear war because of their insistence that the U.S. invade Cuba. If there's no insistence, or if there's no national security state to do the insisting, then there's no reason for the Soviets to put their nuclear missiles there to defend Cuba from an invasion. And so it's really the national security establishment, or the national security state form of governmental structure, that brought us to the edge, and Kennedy realizes this. So he determines that he's going to move America in a totally different direction from what the national security establishment wants, which is, the Russians are coming. We've got to have this huge military intelligence apparatus to protect us and so forth. Kennedy goes to American University on June 10th, just a few months before he's assassinated, and he throws the gauntlet down. And he doesn't consult with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think he may have told one member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that he planned to give this talk, but it was a total ambush. And he starts praising Russia. I mean, imagine if a president did that today. Imagine the anti-Russia sentiment today multiplied by 1,000, and that's June of 1963. And Kennedy goes up and starts praising the Russians and says, let's give them credit. They were the ones that really sacrificed to win World War II. And we have different ideologies. They're communists, we're capitalists, but we can get along. We can have mutual, peaceful coexistence here. There's no reason why we have to go to war or nuclear war or conventional war. We can exist peacefully, coexist peacefully. Wow. This is exactly what Arbenz had done. This is exactly what Allende would do 10 years later. And this is what they were concerned about with Mossadegh and Lumumba. Kennedy was now going down that same road, but he's a U.S. president. He's operating from within. How could you find a graver threat to national security than a man who is now making nice with the communists, just like Arbenz, just like Mossadegh was supposedly, and Lumumba, and later Allende? And this man's the U.S. president. So he gives this peace speech, a remarkable speech, and it was broadcast all across the Soviet Union. Nobody had ever done that before in the Soviet Union. And then he's negotiating personally with Khrushchev. They were circumventing their respective national security establishments, because it turns out that Khrushchev was on the exact same page as Kennedy. He had achieved his own breakthrough and saw how destructive this whole Cold War thing was. This whole racket from their standpoint, too. I mean, the national security establishment in Russia, because they were a national security state, too, they thrived off all these crises, too. Every national security state thrives off of official enemies and crises and so forth. But Kennedy didn't stop there, because now the war was on. And this is all explained in detail in our book at the Future Freedom Foundation called JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated, by Douglas Horne, who served on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board back in the 1990s. So Kennedy doesn't stop there. He says, we're going to enter into negotiations for a nuclear test ban treaty. Because you see, the Pentagon was blowing up nuclear atomic bombs on the surface. In other words, these bombs were like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were here in the United States, and then they moved them over to the Pacific, and they ousted people there just so they could blow up these atomic bombs. And Kennedy learned that when it rains in Washington, there's going to be radiation there. I mean, it was amazing. And the Pentagon was insistent, we have to do these tests. We have to do these tests. And so Kennedy says, no. And so he enters into a nuclear test ban treaty that bans above air testing. He still leaves it underground, and the Pentagon kept exploding these nuclear weapons underground. I mean, which I really find ironic when people say, "Oh, we have to have the federal government take care of the environment." Oh, really? The same government that has just destroyed large parts of the earth with their nuclear weapons? Yeah, right. But over the fierce objection of the Pentagon and the CIA, Kennedy gets this thing enacted by Congress. And the way he did it, he started going on a tour across the country, and he found out that people wanted this. People wanted a peaceful society. They were sick and tired of this Cold War racket. And so they pressured Congress into enacting this, and the Pentagon and the CIA were furious, because now you're disarming America, you see, that you're making it easier for the Reds to get over here and take over our country and the public schools and teach communism in the public schools and so forth. And then you've got Vietnam. Now, Kennedy, because he was standard Cold Warrior, he succumbed to the pressure to send troops into Vietnam to help South Vietnam defeat the communists who were trying to take over the country. Well, it was really just a civil war. The North Vietnam was trying to reunify the country under communist rule. And so Kennedy the military put a lot of pressure on Kennedy to send at least advisors over there to help the South Vietnamese. And that's what Kennedy did. I forget the numbers, maybe 14, 15,000 advisors. He said, no combat troops. You can't, we don't want American troops fighting this war, but you can advise and help out the South Vietnamese. And from my standpoint, he shouldn't even have done that, because he's intervening in a civil war that's none of America's business. It's contrary to our original heritage of non-interventionism. And it ultimately leads to all-out war there, all-out U.S. interventionism. But what Kennedy decides after this breakthrough is he's going to bring all these advisors home. He's done with this thing, because this is now the new outlook that he has. And so he orders 1,000 to be withdrawn. He orders that the rest of them will be withdrawn later after he wins the election in 1964. He had to go cautiously and slowly because he knew that Goldwater would call him, soft on communism, betrayer of America, betrayer of Cuba, and so forth. And so he was playing politics in terms of, well, let's delay it till after I'm elected. But he did order at least 1,000 out, and he ordered all of them out, really, but it was going to be delayed. Well, you can imagine the results of the reaction among the Pentagon and the CIA. I mean, now here's a guy that has already sold out the Cuban people from their perspective. Now he's selling out the Vietnamese people, and that means the communists are going to take over there. The dominoes are going to fall. The Reds are going to be here in the United States. And they really believe this. This is my point. They consider themselves the patriots. They're going to save America from a president who has now become a grave threat to national security, and a president who has become a threat to the national security establishment. Because remember, their whole reason for existence was the Cold War racket. If they don't have the Cold War racket, what do? You sit around twiddling their thumbs? And how do they justify their enormously lucrative racket? The ever-increasing amounts of taxpayer-funded largesse being heaped on them. They need this Cold War. They need Russia as an official enemy. They need communists as an official enemy in order to survive and prosper as a national security state. And here's Kennedy. He's not only moving America in a different direction, he's moving America in a direction that makes the national security establishment meaningless and irrelevant, which means people are inevitably going to say, why can't we have our original governmental system, our limited government republic, back? Because there were still a lot of Americans living at that time who had lived under a limited government republic. Today, nobody ever has. All they know is a national security state form of governmental structure. But back then, there were lots of people that still remembered what it was like to live under a republic. And so inevitably, they would begin clamoring when they see the Pentagon and the CIA twiddling their thumbs and no more Cold War and no more anti-Russia animosity, peaceful coexistence. So Kennedy was posing a grave threat in their minds, not only to national security, but to their own security as a national security establishment. So the war was on at this point. It turns into an all-out war. And Kennedy knew the dangers. There is no question. Now, Kennedy had this remarkable ability to make enemies. I mean, it's incredible how this guy made enemies. But his biggest enemies, especially in the right wing, I mean, the conservative movement. And look at that advertisement in the Dallas Morning News on the day of his assassination. When he saw that, he turns to his wife, Jackie, and says, "We're heading into nut country today." Well, what he should have said was the whole country, the whole right wing, the military, the national security establishment is nutty because of this mindset they had that the Reds were coming to get us, and there was an international communist conspiracy based in Moscow and so forth. But Kennedy had achieved this breakthrough and realized it was nutty. But the war was on, and he knew the dangers. When Eisenhower had alluded to this danger in his farewell address, when he talked about the dangers of this way of life, he called it a military-industrial complex. It's the same name for a national security state or a deep state, whatever label you want to put on this. And he says it's a grave threat to our democratic processes and to our rights and liberties. And now Eisenhower said, well, it's necessary to fight the communists. And here Kennedy was saying, no, it's not necessary to fight the communists because we don't need to be doing this. And so the war was on, and Kennedy knew that the consequences. He had read a novel when he was president called 7 Days in May that posited the dangers of a massive military intelligence establishment that disagreed with the policies of the president because they considered him a grave threat to national security, and they plot an overthrow. And he had friends in Hollywood convert that novel into a movie to serve as a warning to the American people, the same kind of warning that Eisenhower had issued. 30 days after the Kennedy assassination, President Truman, who was responsible for bringing the national security state form of governmental structure into existence, including the CIA in 1947, he wrote an op-ed that was published in the Washington Post that you can see online, where he said, the CIA has become a very sinister force in American life, and the timing could not have been a coincidence. This man knew how the CIA operated. He saw the similarities between CIA operations and the Kennedy assassination. But come November 22nd, 1963, the war comes to an end. Just like in Chile 10 years later, Kennedy was no match. The executive branch was no match in this war for the power of the national security branch of the government. And so they plan a brilliant ambush right there in Dealey Plaza in Dallas. We'll talk about that next week. And they end up murdering the president, ousting him from power in broad daylight, knowing full well that they're going to get away with this. I believe there was really never any possibility that anybody was going to be taken to account for this assassination. The national security branch of the government was just much too powerful. And ever since, every president of the United States understands that you operate within your constraints that are set forth by the national security establishment. Many of you know that I've long recommended a book called National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon. He's a professor of law at Tufts University. He is also a former counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This book, in my opinion, really has insight. Now, it's not about the Kennedy assassination, but his thesis is that for a long time now, it is the national security branch of the government that is controlling the federal government. It lets the other three branches have the veneer of power. They don't care about the veneer. They let them have the veneer of power. So it looks like, oh, the Congress is in charge, the president is in charge, the judiciary is in charge, when in actuality, it is the national security branch of the government that is in charge of the federal government, especially with respect to foreign affairs. And that's one of the lasting consequences of this assassination, and really one of the lasting consequences of having converted America to a national security state form of governmental structure. That's where we are at this point. Like I say, next week's the final episode in this series. This is episode 20. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and thank you for tuning in to the JFK assassination 60 years later.